You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio, news, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch UK Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Haunted Histories with your host Penny G. Morgan, right here on Parasearch UK Radio.
Good evening, everybody. How are we all on this lovely May Wednesday evening? Yes, it's your haunted hostess with the mostess, Penny G. Morgan on Parasearch UK Radio, back for another episode of Haunted Histories. Thank you ever so much for joining me. Well, what are we looking at tonight? So far in the series, we've examined a jail with a G in Kilmainham in Dublin. We've examined a very famous tower in London, and we've looked at some intriguing caves in Chislehurst, Kent, all of which are available for you to listen to, and if you have not managed to already. I can't believe I'm already on my 4th show. The month has just flown by. But as you can hopefully remember, I love my history, and I love my tales of the paranormal, which is why this show is an absolute joy for me to present. I'm always interested in hearing about places that would be good for future shows, so please do feel free to let me know via the Parasearch Facebook page or on, using the Parasearch, can't be words out, webpage. Plus, if you've ever had a paranormal experience in any of the places I've mentioned, or any of the places I'm going to be mentioning, I would genuinely love to hear from you. But, on to tonight. What are we looking at? Well, we're going to be looking into the Canterbury Witch trials, and after the break I will be joined by a special guest, Mr. John Hippersley of Canterbury Ghost Tours. John has also written a book about Canterbury called Haunted Canterbury, which I did read one evening in my friend's pretty haunted flat in Kent when I couldn't sleep. I must admit, the book did not help, but it was very interesting. You can arrange to go on one of John's tours, and I promise you'll not be disappointed. He's a font of knowledge about his city, and as you'll find out shortly, his descriptions of events are pretty much second to none. Although, listening to him on the radio, you won't be able to see him in his cape and walking stick, as they do seem to add to the intrigue and the mystique of the storytelling. But before we get to that, we're going to be looking at the UK at the time of these infamous witch hunts, and what exactly gave Matthew Hopkins, the self-appointed Witchfinder General, the opportunity to basically travel around the south of England, persecuting anyone he could. I don't sound very objective there about him, do I? I'm very sorry. You might be able to get from my tone of voice what I thought of Matthew Hopkins, but anyway. There is very little information about Hopkins in general, such as where he came from and why he had this abject hatred for anyone accused of witchcraft, or rather why he felt it was his duty to rid the world of anyone deemed to deal in witchcraft. However, there are theories that abound as to why he got into it, which we will talk about later. It's believed that he was born in a place called Great Wenham in Suffolk around the 1620 mark or so the historians think, and his father was actually a Puritan clergyman named James, who was actually very popular with his parishioners. So it obviously maybe it wasn't from there that Hopkins got his zealous sort of approach towards anyone accused of witchcraft. Hopkins is believed to have moved to Missley, a little sort of village come town near Manningtree in Essex, and he purchased a place called the Thorn Inn in Missley when he received an inheritance. this believed to be in a vain attempt to establish himself as a gentleman. It's also believed he may have trained as a lawyer, but there's very little evidence of this other than how he would conduct himself in the witch trials, shall we call them. Most people have probably heard of Hopkins, or at least they've heard of the Witchfinder General, but he was actually accompanied by a man named John Stern. It was actually Stern who probably started Hopkins' career as a self-appointed Witchfinder General after, according to his book, The Discovery of Witches, Hopkins overheard various women discussing their meetings with the devil, supposedly, in March around 1644 in Manningtree. In fact, the first accusations were actually made by Stern and not Hopkins, and Hopkins was actually his assistant at the time. And 23 women were accused of witchcraft and tried at Chelmsford in 1645. Because the English Civil War, of which we're going to talk about a little bit more later, was underway, the trial was conducted not by the Justice of the Assize, but actually the Justice of the Peace, and presided over by an earl. 4 of those women, died in prison, and the other 19 were convicted and hung. Whilst most of these trials, if you can call them that, they were a bit one-sided, shall we say, were conducted in East Anglia, so places like Suffolk, Essex, Norfolk and Cambridgeshire, they did venture down to Kent, and this is where John will come in later and let us know what happened and the methods of torture. Although legally they weren't actually allowed to use torture, but you will find out that the methods they used, I think torture's a pretty apt term for them. And then how these witches were killed, because there's a lot of misinformation in sort of history as to how that happened. Hopkins' witch hunting methods were actually outlined in his book, The Discovery of Witches, which I mentioned earlier, which was published in 1647. These practices were actually recommended in law books, believe it or not. And during the year following the publication of Hopkins' book, trials and executions for witchcraft began in the New England colonies. And this was there was a description in the journal of Governor John Winthrop. The evidence assembled against one of the women who was convicted, Margaret Jones, was actually gathered by the use of Hopkins' technique of searching and watching. Jones's execution was actually the first in a witch hunt that lasted in New England from 1648 until 1663, and about 80 people throughout New England were accused of practicing witchcraft during that period. 15, I believe, were women and 2 men, and all of those were actually executed. Some of Hopkins' methods, again, were employed during the infamous Salem witch trials, which occurred, funnily enough, primarily in Salem, which is in Massachusetts, during 1692 to 93. And these trials resulted in around 19 executions, with one man, somebody called Giles Corey, was actually pressed to death for refusing to plead, and you might hear John mention later talking about that, because I believe that was one of the methods of torture that was used. The actual Hopkins period, though, was actually a very, very short time. It was only 3 years, from around the 1644 to 47, because that's when he died. It's 1647. They believe he was around 25, the 27 mark when he actually died, so he was quite a young man anyway. He's actually meant to be buried in Missley, but I'm not going to go into too much about Missley, because not only is it just up the road from me, it's also got a lot of its own ghosts and its own tales for us to tell, so you never know, listen out for another show on that later if you want to hear more about Hopkins. But what we do know is that Hopkins' witch hunts did coincide with the first part of the English Civil War, which lasted from 1642 to 1646. Now, what was this? What was the English Civil War? Well, it was a series of armed conflicts between the Roundheads, basically the parliamentarians, and the Cavaliers, the Royalists. Now, if you were listening last week, I mentioned Cavaliers because there's a Cavalier haunting at Chislehurst Caves. And when I said that most people think of Cavaliers as being just literally a style of quite flamboyant dress with the ringlets, hair, they were actually supporters of Charles I. Well, what was very different back then, back in the 1640s, was that the monarchy actually had a lot of control over what actually happened with Parliament. They had more control than Parliament. And when Charles I took to the throne on the death of his father, James I, he actually wanted to unite England and Scotland. And many English parliamentarians had suspicions regarding such a move, because they feared that setting up this new kingdom would destroy the old English traditions which had bound the English monarchy. There was also a belief that, and Charles' father, James, had espoused this belief and promoted it, that if you were a monarch, it was determined by God, and basically you were little gods on earth, and perhaps, let's say, some of the monarchy might have acted a bit too much like that, and perhaps it was justified that Parliament were concerned. But because Parliament lacked any legal means of forcing its will upon the monarch, its only leverage with the king was the threat of withholding financial means that he required to execute any of his plans, which actually led to a period of nearly 11 years when Charles ruled without a Parliament. I cannot help but think this probably did not help his cause when he was viewed as being just a little bit arrogant and not able to take advice. Whilst this was not the only thing that led to his subsequent execution in 1649, I guess it probably didn't help. Of the English Civil War, there was actually 3 parts to it, but it gave us some very, very famous battles that you've probably heard of and didn't realise what they were about. You've got the Battle of Naseby in 1645, the Battle of Edgehill in 1642, the Battle of Marston Moor in 1644, just to name but 3. And there is a belief that during this unsettled period, the people were looking for a scapegoat, to find someone who maybe was a bit different to blame for the upheaval in everything. And when Matthew Hopkins came along, and the first major trials really started, he gave the perfect opportunity for people to focus on something else. It is interesting, though, that historians do believe that whilst Hopkins and Stern, his cohort, who was originally the boss and Hopkins was the assistant, but the roles reversed, may definitely have believed in witchcraft, which people probably did back then, it certainly wasn't something new. And researching for this programme, there's still an awful lot of tales of more recent times of people being accused of witchcraft. It was also a money-making activity for them, as they charged people for identifying witches. For example, Hopkins' average fee was 20 shillings per town, as he said this was necessary for his accommodation and for horses and for sustenance. In Stowmarket in Suffolk, the records state he took around £23 in their money, which in today would have been around £3,500, £3,400 or thereabouts. So it was a money-making scheme for him. There's no records to suggest that Oliver Cromwell, who was the then main Member of Parliament, and became the Lord Protector once Charles I was executed. He was also the leaders of something called the New Model Army, who were basically an army created by disillusioned Roundheads after the conduct of the parliamentarian armies during the start of the first part of the Civil War. Cromwell himself was actually from Huntingdon in Cambridge, and he was also the Member of Parliament for there. And this was one of the places that was very heavily targeted by Hopkins. So it would be a surprise if he wasn't aware of what was going on, but maybe he just felt he had enough to deal with trying to sort out the running of the country and dealing with that side of things. But as to a bit of a background to the whole subject of witch hunts, they weren't actually limited to England alone. Most people have heard of the Salem witch trials, which were towards the end of the 1600s, but an estimated 75 to 85% of those accused in the early modern witch trials around Europe were women. And there is certainly evidence of a kind of misogyny on the part of those people who were persecuting witches, evident from quotes by somebody called Nicholas Ramey of 1595, that it is not unreasonable that this scum of humanity, witches, should be drawn chiefly from the female sex. He also said the devil uses them because he knows that women love carnal pleasures, and he means to bind them to his allegiance by such agreeable provocations. He really didn't like women very much, did he? In early modern Europe, it was widely believed that women were actually less intelligent than men and therefore more susceptible to sin. I guess it's all about Adam and Eve again and that blasted apple in the Garden of Eden that they'll never let go for us. Anyway, nevertheless, it's been argued that the supposedly misogynistic agenda of works on witchcraft has been greatly exaggerated based on the selective repetition of a few relevant passages of the Malleus Maleficarum, a book written by Austrian-German clergyman Heinrich Kramer that was published in 1487, which actually instructed on the extermination of witches and went through legal and theological reasons as to how and why. Many historians argue that the witch hunts can't be explained simplistically as an expression of male misogyny, as indeed women were frequently accused actually by other women, to the point that witch hunts, at least at the local level of the villages, have been described as being driven primarily by women's quarrels. So in other words, women bitching at each other, especially at the margins of Europe. But in some parts, in Iceland, Finland, Russia, for example, the majority of those accused were actually men. So another historian, Barstow, in 1994, claimed that a combination of factors, including the greater value placed on men as workers in the increasingly wage-orientated economy and a greater fear of women as inherently evil, loaded the scales against women, even when the charges were against them were identical to those against the men. Thurston, in 2001, saw this as part of a general misogyny of the late medieval and early modern periods, which had increased during what he described as the persecuting culture, from what it had been in the early medieval period. Gunnar Heinschen and Otto Steiger, in a 1982 publication, speculated that witch hunts targeted women skilled in midwifery specifically, in an attempt to extinguish knowledge about birth control and basically repopulate Europe after the population catastrophe of the Black Death. This is quite a commonly held belief that a lot of witches were basically midwives and herbalists. But as with all things historical, there are debates as to the validity of those kind of claims, as you'd expect. But this does coincide with the misogyny theory, as only men back then were allowed to be medical practitioners and would not have actually had the knowledge of herbs and homeopathy that these women would have had. So perhaps the men felt, I don't know, threatened by it, which was why they tended to lead the trials and then just rely on the natural, I suppose, argumentative nature of women to actually point the finger at people. I don't know. I do have a feeling, however, we may come back to this at some point, as there's quite a few other trials we could discuss and go over the reported activities there in modern times, things like the Salem witch trials, the Pendle witch trials, and I'm sure we're going to come back to Matthew Hopkins at some point in time. But coming back to the terror of what Hopkins was actually doing, remember, he was actually charging a lot of money to bring these witches to justice. I say witches, but a lot were probably widows and ladies who had never married and had cats to keep them company, the stereotypical witches familiar. There's an awful lot of publications about it that the women who were perceived to be witches were just those women who had never married, who were the spinsters, who maybe had a facial deformity that they were born with. Maybe they didn't speak properly because they had a speech deformity. All those kind of things that made them a little bit different, and people were scared of them. And a lot of those were the ones that the reports you read about, the fingers were pointed at. It does unnerve me slightly when I look at all of this kind of thing to see the amount of activity there was in my home county of Essex. But I guess it just gives more fuel for my sort of shows and history and everything else. That some of the places that these poor people were held and executed and everything else are literally on my doorstep. And the Thorn Inn in Missley does still exist. So it's quite an interesting one because things are very, very accessible to me. Unfortunately, most of those places you can't actually do a proper paranormal investigation at. But, you know, I live in hope, and maybe one day we will. Anyway, So you can imagine the amount of money that Hopkins was earning from this. If he was earning the equivalent of £3,500 just to spend a couple of months in a place, he was earning a month's salary for, well, not even a week's worth, not even any work whatsoever. And the activity was getting quite intense. It was reaching almost like a fever pitch. If you've ever seen films on the Salem witch trials and everything, you do see that kind of fever and stuff like going through the whole community. Well, this is reported that it was happening, and the finger pointing was getting more and more. So someone needed to stop this, and ironically, it was actually a vicar who brought a halt to it, and his name was the Reverend John Gall, and he was the vicar of a place called Great Stoughton, however it's pronounced. And Gall basically said that he didn't doubt for a second that witches existed. He was a vicar. He would have believed from a religious perspective probably that witches and evil and Satan and all those kind of things actually existed. But he felt it was more likely connected to nothing but group superstition than actual sources derived from scripture. He even wrote to his local MP for Huntingdon, this time it wasn't Cromwell, it was somebody else, but to expose the methods being used by Hopkins. He saw that unfortunate people, like I mentioned, those people who might be looked a bit different, women who'd never married, people who had facial deformities, probably even people with mental illnesses, mental health problems, were being persecuted so unreasonably, and that Matthew Hopkins and Stern, to a point, although most people forget about him, were potentially driving this forward because it was a way for him to make money. Don't forget that he actually charged people for identifying the witches. Gall felt that there should be a much more stringent review of the evidence, but he did acknowledge that circumstantial evidence was essential, because who was going to admit to being a witch, knowing full well that they were likely to be executed? Although when John talks about some of the methods that were used to get people to admit whether they were witches, a lot of them are quite horrific, and you'd probably admit it just to get yourself put out of the pain that you were in. I think I would. So was Reverend Gall the reason for Hopkins' money-making scheme stopping? We don't know. Very little we know about what stopped it, and how he was brought to heel, so to speak, because Hopkins died in around 1647, supposedly from tuberculosis, and as I mentioned earlier, he's meant to be buried in Missley. It's very hard, though, to feel anything but, for me anyway, anything but dislike for someone like Hopkins, because there's no record as to why he acted the way he did. Don't forget that these women, let's face it, they were predominantly women who were brought to him, would be looked at for witches' marks, for example. So they would be stripped naked, and they would be looking for things like moles and scars and birthmarks and sores, because these would be deemed to be a sort of a nipple for feeding Satan's minions from. Who doesn't have a mole? Who doesn't have a scar? The likelihood of them finding someone who didn't have one of these, I suppose they would call them deformities, who'd been accused, was very, very, very rare. And even those women who were so scared that it was going to happen to them and were trying sort of almost self-surgically remove these marks were then still accused, because it was obvious that they were trying to hide something. I think it bothers me that it was a very abusive period, and he was abusive towards the women. But that might just be me as a woman, the way it sort of has made me feel when I look at this sort of stuff. But we haven't even talked about some of the other methods that they would use that I believe John will probably mention, because I know he's talked about them before when I've been on the tour. The fact that Hopkins would take women out with him who would do the pricking, as they called it, because they believed if these were the marks of the devil, they wouldn't bleed. It really was, even though they weren't allowed to torture people. Some of it must have been quite severe psychological torture. Anyway, on that note, I think it's a good time to have a little break. When we come back, we will be talking with John Hipsley of Canterbury Ghost Tours, and he can tell us in detail about the records that show what happened in Canterbury during the witch trials in the 1640s.
You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.
Right.
Hi, and we're back. I'd like to introduce my special guest for the second half of this show on the Canterbury Witch Trials, and it's Mr. John Hipsley. Hi, John.
Hi.
Hi. Now, John, if you've never had the pleasure, actually runs the Canterbury Ghost Tours, funnily enough, in Canterbury. How long have you been doing that for, John?
Well, rather depressingly, I've been doing it since 1991, so that's
really
forever, doesn't it? I did have a real job, but it turns out it's just much nicer doing this than it is doing my real job, which is a customs officer.
Right.
Nobody says thank you if you do a good job as customs. That's certainly not management. But generally, I get a good bit of feedback, and I occasionally get a few moaning people who complain they didn't see a ghost. A lot of nice guarantee seeing a ghost for a tenner, but it's unlikely to be happening. They don't seem to be on site. I always imagine them sitting on top of the roof looking down at me going, what's he on about now? Come on.
Yeah, they probably say, I don't like those people. They're being rude. I'm not going to appear for them.
Yeah.
I think we didn't, when I came on it in January, it was very, very informative. And I mmust admit, my friend and I were laughing quite a bit at your sense of humour, and especially when you were making people jump, that did actually make us laugh. But I think it was the Canterbury wildlife that we saw when we came through it. The young girl who basically had a skirt round her ears and was accusing us of looking at her. That was, that probably what kept the ghosts away, really, that she was scarier than they were. But the point, but what I wanted to say is if anyone's ever in Canterbury, it's well worth, because John's knowledge is really, really good about the area. And for the 10 quid, is it for the tour, did you say?
Yeah,
it's about 10 quid.
Yeah.
It's well worth going on. It's well worth going on. But I will say, if it is the winter that you go on it, wrap up warm, because it gets a bit chilly. The reason I asked John to be on the show is John obviously is a bit of an expert on Canterbury and the history and the ghost side of things. Because didn't you also write Haunted Canterbury?
I did, yeah. I
book.
Canterbury 2006 or something. It's on sale now on Amazon and everywhere else.
I've actually read it. I have read it. I mentioned earlier in my my show that when I was staying at my friend's one time, she used to live in a flat that was. We both said there was something going on there that couldn't be explained. And one night I couldn't sleep, and I picked up that book, and it really didn't help me sleeping. But it was interesting. It was very interesting. On to the witch trials in general. When do we know roughly when they took place actually in Canterbury? Because we know that Hopkins was doing them from between sort of 1644 to about 1647 when he died. Do we know roughly what period that would have been?
1643. It was about the year before that. He was invited by the Archbishop of Canterbury to get rid of our witches. We still have plenty, as you saw that night.
They painted witches in a bad light.
That's funny because lots of stuff about witches that, as a result of doing the tours, I've learned, oddly, since I've been doing the tours. So, I know a bit about Hopkins and Manningtree, but it was only where he moved to. It was where he was born.
It was, yeah.
Missenden or something like that, wasn't it? And I've been up there.
A place called Missley, which is near Manningtree. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Manningtree was supposedly the smallest town in England at one time, but obviously 3 hamsters and a chap called Boris moved in, and that was it. It became too busy for them, so you have to move down. But as far as I know, the church records say that he came down in 1642 to 1643 on the auspices of getting rid of some, and his sidekick, who he was the sidekick to originally, what his name was, he had links to Canterbury anyway. He had a sister living down here, so.
Oh, right.
And got come on down Hopkins, and we know that Hopkins made a lot of money by his admin costs, which a lot of self-employed people do, saying why admin costs are much higher than they look. But I don't know what administration costs he had apart from writing out that this is definitely a witch and she weighs more than the Bible, therefore she's a witch. But I can't imagine how I think he paid, was it nearly £3,500 from one village?
Something like that, yeah.
It's an awful lot of money. I presume they said, if you don't pay, we'll just leave the witch with you.
Well, Stowmarket, I mentioned earlier, I think it was £23 in old money in the 1640s, which is about £3,500 in today's money, just to get rid of some witches. So that probably weren't even witches in the first place.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the third thing is, I think the word witchcraft that we see it today comes from the Wiccan craft, which is the other religion, which is the religion before Christianity. So when we say things like touch wood, it's from the Wiccan craft and not from any sort of paganism. And then, of course, the other thing was, of course, Hopkins devised a way of persecuting these people based on the fact that they were in league with the devil. But if you're a pagan, then you're not a believer in the devil either. So there's a pretty tenuous link there.
So how many do they do the church records say were actually reported and tried?
1,800 in Canterbury.
Right.
Now, interesting enough, because I checked other records, there seems to be there's no documentary evidence apart from the stuff in the archive. It wasn't published. In fact, I was always told off for telling people about them because the church said they didn't exist. Although, the church still believe in witchcraft as being an evil force, because when Harry Potter's producers came down here in the sort of late 90s and asked for permission to film in the cloisters, they initially said, "Oh yeah, £5 million for 5 minutes work, don't go for that." And then when the dean said, "Well, what's the script?" and he looked at the script, he said, "I can't have that. It's about witches." So they turned down all the money just because they wouldn't allow anything to do with the witchcraft, even if it's just a film. But even if a film suggests that witchcraft is a good thing, then they couldn't have their money in it. So, whilst they might spend their life denying ghosts exist and saying that witches don't exist either, they strongly believe in witchcraft and ghosts.
Yeah. Well, it's a way of controlling people as well, isn't it? If you believe in the bad stuff, they can control you and say that don't do it, and the good stuff will happen, kind of thing. So how was it? I do remember going on the tour. You did talk in depth about how they tried them, the flying, for example. Can you tell us about that? Because that was quite astounding.
Basically, Hopkins developed an idea. Now, he hadn't been to Italy, but the chap he worked with, his sidekick, had been to the Doge's Palace in Venice.
Yeah.
And he saw a trial there of a criminal who was hoisted by his arms and then let go onto a bed of nails. Now, I think he thought it'd be quite difficult to organise in England, but we could do the height trial nonetheless. The Saxons had a torture called the hoisting. Quite a lot of places around England that have a place called the hoisting post, often confused with the hitching post. But the hoisting post was basically like a huge, long, tall tree with a pulley at the top of it. And then the arms of the accused were tied behind their back. They were hoisted up using, in this case, a bell rope of St Margaret's Church. But in the case of a hoisting post, then it just could be a massive rope from a ship. And the first wrench of the rope would wrench the arms out of the shoulder sockets. The second wrench would take the muscle tissue from the bone. And the third wrench would take all the tendons off the bone too. So just to be hanging on by bits of skin, sometimes as high as 80 feet up in the case of St Margaret's Church Tower. Some of the church towers in Canterbury aren't that at all. So the point was that even if they jumped from the top, they probably wouldn't die, but there'd be horrendous injuries. And because the natural action of the body is when you fall, you put your hands out to protect yourself. But if your arms have been ripped off your shoulder blades, you won't be able to protect yourself. So it's head first in the dirt.
Yeah.
And Hopkins believed, quite possibly, through no fault of his own, that if the witch died, then she wasn't a witch, because a witch would present to herself as being killed, whereas an innocent person would be taken by God, and therefore she wouldn't be a witch. Because it wasn't just women, there were men too. There's only about 2 men, as far as I know, tried for witchcraft and found guilty. So not in Canterbury, though. Research.
Yeah, I think the male one, it was more other parts of Europe.
Yeah.
Were sort of focused more on male witches, whereas England and America really as well, the US, when they had their witch trials with Salem and everything, they focused on the women. So they hoisted them up to the top of this tower.
And then they would ask them if they were a witch. Now, I suppose if you're in the case you weren't a witch, you'd probably say, no, I'm not a witch, no. And if you were a witch, you might well be denying it. Because Hopkins rewrote the Witchcraft Act, which at the time, it wasn't a real act, it was just... and he wasn't even recognised by Parliament. He wasn't agreed by Parliament at all.
No.
But he just sort of self-confessed, head of the witch trials. And he said that if they deny themselves being a witch publicly 3 times, they are a witch. The original law written down by Becket said that if they said they're not a witch, you've got to let them go. So hardly anybody was convicted of the original act.
Was this Thomas Becket who was murdered at Canterbury?
Yeah, he wrote a law down in about 1160 based on a book called Malus Maleficarum, which wasn't properly published in England until about 1540, but it was an Austrian priest who wrote it down in Latin. And it was a known seminal work in the papal world that you could use this book to hunt witches. Basically, the hammer of the witch, Malleus Maleficarum.
Heinrich Kramer was his actual German Austrian name.
That's right. Yeah. The interesting thing was that he was credited with also being used this thing in the Inquisition. They used the same book, but in their case, they supposed witch was anybody of the Jewish faith. So they basically got rid of the same idea. They had odd teeth or anything like that, anything they could stick in the crowd. And Maleficarum suggested that where the witch suckled on the devil left a witch's mark, which at that point could feel no pain. And so technically it was quite possible that there was a mole or something like that. Anybody has any malformation on the skin. And where it was pricked with a witch pricker, they would feel no pain. So Hopkins certainly used to apply a blunt knife to the skin and then say, look, see, she can feel no pain. She doesn't even bleed because she's covered in these witches' warts and therefore won't suffer in torture. But they weren't allowed to torture people. That was against...
Yeah.
But a confession could be extracted by, I think Hopkins tend to use sleep deprivation, but they also had pressing of charge. You know the expression pressing of charge, where they lay the accused on the ground and pile rocks on them until they confess. That's to press charges. I mean, even say that it's still used in the English language to say to press charges. You think that somebody's robbed you, you say, yes, I'd like to press charges, but using the 17th century ruling of the pressing charges. So lay them on the ground and we'll pile rocks on them. And that'd be nice if we could get them back there, without being sort of changing the justice system. Maybe now that we're coming out of Europe, we might go back to the medieval system of justice.
Well, I don't know. I think that there was one other one I read, a torture method where they'd sit them on hot coals and see how long they could cope with things like that. So, but it's not torture, is it?
Well,
so they'd throw them off the building, they'd tie their arms up behind them so their shoulders were wrenched out, they'd throw them off, and if they were a witch, they'd fly. If they didn't, then they were dead, and they were obviously not a witch. What would they do then if they survived?
Well, the next stage was the water trial. Now, in Canterbury, there's a ducking stool, but as far as Hopkins never used a ducking stool.
Oh, right.
Although sometimes they were strapped into a chair and thrown into a river, but not in the case of dunking it. That ducking stool in Canterbury was used at Fordwich in Kent until the 1950s. It was part of the Civil Acts. Fordwich, being the smallest town in England, had a town hall, and within the town hall, the Lord Mayor had rights to duty on criminals, and criminals could be anybody, including drunk and disorderly people in the streets, of which we saw plenty even on the night you came. For some reason they have rights. But the law at the time, until 1950 in Fordwich, certainly was that if you found somebody drunk and disorderly, you could strap them into what's now called the ducking stool and dunk them into the water for 5 minutes or so they wouldn't drink again. Now, most people can't survive 5 minutes out of the water without breathing, so the chances are that anybody that actually tried in that way would probably die anyway. And if they survived for 5 minutes out of the water, they had incredibly good lung capacity. Highly unlikely, but we know that they did dunk them in the water only for a couple of seconds, just to shock them. And if you've been drinking heavily, that will sober you up pretty quickly. Yeah. But in the case of the women, it was believed that they weren't baptized, and if they weren't baptized, they'd be rejected by things made by God, water being one of them, in the 7 days process. And So if you threw a witch into a river, they would bounce or they'd be rejected by water. So what they did was, before this happened, where they would force the woman to bend over and touch her knees, not that she had any choice because the hands are ripped off her arms. And when the hands were at the knees, she was laid down on the ground, and they administered a 7-inch iron nail from the back of the hands to the top of the meniscus in the and that would affect their ability to swim.
Yeah.
Then around the neck they tied a millstone, because the millstone produced holy bread. Therefore, it was a holy thing, but not a Christian cross, which would have been too religious. And that was placed around the neck in a strap. And then a rope was placed around the neck, and they were lowered in from King's Bridge into the river, which is a lot deeper than it is now. It's only about sort of 4 foot deep now, but in the 16th century it was about 8 foot deep, and you couldn't sort of stand on tiptoes and survive that. And so if a woman survived the church tower fall, I think it was about, 1,800 people tested at St Margaret's Church, and 800 survived. So the odds weren't brilliant, but it wasn't sort of 50-50. So of the 800, 799 died at the river, and one woman survived by hiding a straw, apparently, not a drinking straw, but a piece of straw around her face, and she used wax to adhere it to her flesh. And she survived for about 5 minutes under the water without breathing. But she was throttling on herself and thrashing around, but she survived. And I can imagine the situation. You've got a whole crowd of the public going, well, she'll never make that. And then she survived, so people go, oh, Christ, she really is a witch.
Yeah. Yeah.
Shock. She was taken to the Buttermarket Square by the cathedral to be laid on the ground to have hot tar poured over her. Now, those that died in the river were taken outside the city and buried in unconsecrated ground at a place called the Crossroads of the city. Most cities had a crossroads where the bandits, robbers, and beggars were hung, and all murderers were buried in unconsecrated ground so that the devil would take them. They were also buried head first in the dirt, because the theory was that if they woke after death or were reincarnated, they would dig their way out of their grave. But, of course, not knowing where they were, disorientated, they would dig themselves close to hell. So if you ever find a body that's been buried head first from that period, it means murderer or thief or bandit. And the suicides, of course, had taken their own life, so they were going to burn in hell anyway. Suicide was illegal until 1961. And the case of this witch, we know this one woman called Madame Desjardins. She came from a place called Arras, near northern part of Calais, and she was tried. She had a proper long trial. It was a long time after Hopkins, but they poured this hot tar over her, and they said that when they poured the hot tar onto her, she made the hissing, spitting sound of a witch, which is basically the sound of the flesh melting under the heat of the tar, about 600 degrees centigrade boiling. Oil, and then as she became tacky or sticky, they threw a bag of feathers over her, the cleansing process of tarring and feathering, still used in Northern Ireland for certain crimes. And then she was placed on a cart and carted down through Mercery Lane, through St Margaret Street, through Castle Street to the castle, where she was placed on the castle mound, a higher level than normal. And at her feet they placed bundles of wood called faggots. Yes. Not those disgusting things you can get in meatballs, made of real brains, as my sister used to tell me, and not people from America from a certain sexual orientation, as a lot of people assume. Then at the throat they tied the muzzlers and catherine, which is 12 gunpowder charges, often seen around musketeers' chests. These are basically one charge of gunpowder per musket ball. They were called the 12 Apostles, placed around the neck to make it more attractive for children. And then the mouth was forced open, and a 12-foot iron rod called a witch stabber would be placed in the throat and then nailed the throat to the trunk of a tree. And when that happened, she would have screamed something in Dutch, like, which, would have been, yes, you've got Mama Witch in Dutch. According to the trial that happened, that's what she made the sound of a foreign language. So probably not Dutch, but the sound
Maybe
of
that was translated as "it's a fair cop."
That's right.
Maybe that's what it would have translated to. You got me.
Dusted. And then because she was covered in hot tar, she would have acted as a wick. So when they set fire to the feet, the legs burned first, and as the wick, it would take about 30 minutes to burn it to nothing, but the first real flash of light would rip straight out the body. The legs used to break, and then the body would have dropped on its own weight, slicing the neck wound through the top of the cranium. And then the waist exploded. The acid in the stomach would burn the front of the crowd, and then the chest cavity would explode, and bits of lung and chest tissue would blow out of the back of the crowd. Then finally, a huge explosion as the gunpowder charge went off and blew the head from the witch. Now, if she survived that, major problems. She would have definitely sued for malformation of character. No, and the experiments that Hopkins did, more were hung than burned, but burning very rare.
I was going to say that the stake burning was normally more the European witches. Yeah. It's a bit of a fallacy that in this country that witches were burnt at the stake. They were more likely to have been hung.
I think it comes from the Hammer House of Horror version where Hopkins was portrayed as a beast. I don't know if he was a beast. He was quite young. He was only about 27 when he died.
He was, he was 20. Well, they believe he was about 25 to 27 because they don't know exactly when he was born.
Yeah, but it's quite possible that he was literally a zealot. I mean, at 13, you could have been, 13, you were a married man. So by 27, he could have been an old man in that respect. And the average lifespan of people was pretty low anyway, plus the fact that people died in the Civil War. So I think because there was a civil war going on, people turned a blind eye to it. And because of the religious fervour of saying, you can't trust the Catholics or vice versa, this guy was just basically getting rid of the opposition.
Plus with the Puritan Protestants and everything else, there was the sort of gathering momentum then as well. Although interestingly, when you go to look at some of the European ones, it was the Catholic faith that was the predominant faith, and yet the Puritans were anti-Catholic, yet they were kind of endorsing the same thing, or almost. So that we say that the fallacy of them being burnt at the stake, it wasn't true in this country. It did tend to be more hangings. Where would the hangings have been in Canterbury? Do we know?
All hangings always took place outside the city walls and generally at crossroads, because they'd come to a crossroads in their life. So they decided to make a route to witchcraft from wherever they were and turn their back on Christianity. Therefore, they had to be hanged or shown to be hung outside the city walls, simply because when visitors came from outside the city, they would see the gallows hanging, and that would show that justice was done in the city, and that's what it was all about. It was all about show. There were 4 gallows in the city of Canterbury, one at Wincheap, we know, for the witch burnings. They also executed quite a lot of Protestants down there before the Civil War, and afterwards the Catholics were burned there. A place called Martyrsfield Road, it's now the Wincheap area, surrounded by students. On the other end of the city, a place called Worthgate Place, which is quite close to Wincheap Green. And there was a gallows there. There was another gallows up at the top of Canterbury in a place called Oaton Hill, which is where the millers were. And that was the gallows post is still there on a little triangle of land where they park cars. And then at the south, there's Northgate, another gate of the city, which is no longer there. There was a gallows there. There's one at St Stephen's Green. They were all over the city, basically, but all entrances to the city by horseback. You would see the gallows, the gibbet cage generally. Sometimes when somebody was hung, they were placed in a gibbet cage to rot, so that people would see a rotting corpse and know that, again, justice is being held here. It's a horrible, brutal thing. You probably know that at Tyburn, that when they were hanging, often people didn't hang the first time. And so people there called hangers-on, who would hang on your coattails to pull you down to break your neck. Yeah. So the expression is, I'm only pulling his leg, was just an expression saying, I'm only pulling his leg to break his neck to save his life.
Well, supposedly that's what they did to Guy Fawkes when he was hung, because he wasn't actually dying quick enough, and they knew he was then going to be taken down just before he died and hung, drawn and quartered. Yeah. The report is that a local priest actually did grab on his legs to pull his legs to actually break his neck so that he wasn't alive when the next part of the process was done. I think there was a similar story to a priest actually in Chelmsford who was executed, and somebody did the same thing to him because they felt it was wrong that he was being hung, and why should he go through that kind of torture.
It was hung as well at Tyburn.
Sorry?
Dick Turpin was hung at Tyburn. Yes. The knot was placed at the under the chin. The theory being that when the knot snapped upwards, it would snap his neck, but unfortunately the knot slipped in his case and snapped his windpipe but didn't break his neck, so he survived for 15 minutes till they cut it down when his eyeballs and his tongue had popped out of his head. So he throttled his own juices, which is a pretty gruesome way to go. I suppose that's why they always say tip the executioner, and that's what they used to do.
It's also why they changed the knot that they used in nooses to the hangman's noose. So the knot, that sort of strange knot, rather than just a loop, it had the knot, so it did actually break the neck straight away. It's all getting a bit gruesome, isn't it, John? Yeah. Whereabouts did they hold the witches in Canterbury? If they whereabouts would they have held them as prisoners?
Well, most of them are held at the city jail, which is outside the city walls. But there were 2 jails in the city. The more recent one is the Westgate Jail, which was a debtor's jail. But that was often used because it was a good location, being the top end of Canterbury. People would see the witches, being paraded around the city in coven. And the word coven, of course, comes from the fact that the witches used to meet outside the city walls of any city and bemoan the Catholics or the Protestants, whoever they were in charge, about how awful they were. They used to put their cloaks of office around the edge, and their broomsticks would be in the middle, and the cats that familiar would walk around the outside. And that's what a coven comes from. So a witches' coven is simply a gathering of witches just to bemoan Christianity, and probably rightly so. Unless a gay gets burnt in hell at some point for that. But control and Christianity are the same words, aren't they? It's literally control. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, anyone who's listened to my show knows that I have bad experiences whenever I go into churches. Every church I seem to go into, I have a negative experience in. So to make of that what you will. So the big question: are there any hauntings in the Canterbury area attributed to Hopkins?
Well, there is. Yeah, I mean, there's a room in St Margaret Street where he stayed. With his mate, top floor of what is now
John
called
Stern. John Stern was his mate.
Oh, was it John Stern? Yeah. Well, they stayed together. They may well have had a sexual relationship. I was quite sure because there wasn't much witnessing then. That was, of course, a crime against Christianity, lying with another man. But Louis XIV thought that was okay. So was his brother did. It was Duke of Orleans. I think, there's certainly visitations of Hopkins in that room. He's been seen and felt by several people 300 or 400 years. And Hopkins is one of the rarer ghosts of the city. We've got Marlowe and Dickens and Queen Elizabeth I and Beckett as being a sort of famous five, as they were. But when people see Hopkins, they don't know him as Hopkins because he's not famous. So just some bloke with a pointy beard and a ruff. It could be anybody, I've never understood why ghosts supposedly appear in sort of contemporary costume of their time of their death. It doesn't make no sense to me at all, because presumably the one thing that would survive is the spirit, but that would just be a body, a corporeal body, not what they were wearing necessarily. Unless the human mind says, well, they can't be naked, clearly, so we're going to have to put some clothes on them, and we'll associate them with what the period of the house we're in. So it doesn't make any sense.
Could be. Or it could just be that in the case of Hopkins, it's actually kind of one of those residual, I can't get my words out now, a residual one. It's not one that's an interactive ghost. It's just one that's repeating almost like a video that's stuck on loop.
Yeah.
Oh, it's interesting. Well, we've been chatting now for half an hour, believe it or not, John. It's been fascinating, the same as it was when I came on the tour, and I'm sure next time I come down to Canterbury, I'll be coming on it again. So you're going to have to put something new in it for me next time.
I'll look you next time. Do some more research. Yeah.
But thank you ever so much for joining us on Haunted Histories, Parasearch UK Radio. As I say, John has his own company, the Canterbury Ghost Tours. There's a website, canterburyghostttours.com. That you can go on there. You can pre-book the tours. I think you can actually pre-book private group tours.
You can,
as well, yeah. Well worth going on if you're down in Canterbury, because Canterbury is a plethora of history and information. For a history buff like me, it's perfect. So that just leaves me to say thank you ever so much for joining me, John. My name is Penny G. Morgan. This is Haunted Histories, and one last thing to say to everyone is goodbye, sleep tight, and don't worry about things that go bump in the night.
You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.